Hey, how you doing? This is Jerry Logan, professor of sociology. Class is sex, gender, power. We're going to talk about chapter 9, which is women, crime, and violence. This particular chapter is, like I said, I've been criticized for things. I criticize my students laugh at me sometimes about me being long-winded. So I just want to kind of hit on some of the main points of this particular chapter, kind of give you more of a lecture and feel of what this chapter is about in preparation also for exam 2, which does include this chapter right here. So when we look at the definition of social deviance, remember deviance and crime are two different things. They kind of correlate, but at the same time, as deviance is a violation of the norms. And remember, norms is expectations of right behavior based upon what society established. So the violation of norms for rules or expectations, any transgression of socially established norms. So you committed a deviant act, but necessarily you may not be breaking the law. It is like this, it's a spoken rule, but it is supposed to be the norm of society. It's like, oh, you can't do this. This is a deviant act. And everybody's socially understood and is socially accepted. It then becomes a crime when there's a violation of the law, which is enacted by society. So you can do a deviant act and may not be arrested for it. But however, when you commit a crime, you can and be subjected to being arrested. So hopefully you are not trying to do any deviant acts, let alone any crime. So that's the difference between deviance and crime. So again, deviance, the rule, the expectations, this is something you're not supposed to do. You should know better, sort of type of thing. But then even though it's the same thing with crime, we know better not to commit criminal acts. But at the same time, it is a law enacted by society. So when you do a deviant act and it does involve breaking a crime, you can be subjected to arrest on this violation of the law. Stigma in itself is a blemish that discredits a person's claim to a normal identity. So you may have a stigma. There may be stigmas about certain groups of people. Some people are, oh, young people, this or this group of people, or this family group, family members. So it may be a stigma that carries along with that particular person's identity. Is that blemish that says, okay, it discredits this person because they have a stigma on them. I remember I was growing up as a kid, and there was a family group had large family members, and they all were very violent, very violent, like to fight and stuff like that. And so the stigma is that they were very violent, they like to fight. So even when they had younger brothers coming up, that stigma carried with them. It's like, oh, he just like the rest of them. So for the exam, also make sure you know the definitions of deviance, crime, and stigma. So framing the study of crime and deviance should relate the connection between gender and the studies of crime and deviance. Part of this chapter we're going to talk about, which is posed by the author, is that you can start to see the influence of gender on crime by asking some simple questions. Why are men the vast majority of those who commit violent acts? How can we explain the high rates of violence against women in society, and why do women commit fewer crimes than men do? Are there distinctive characteristics of women as deviants and criminals? Are some of the questions that the author poses for this particular chapter. These and other questions form the basis for the study of gender, crime, and deviance, a field that has been transformed through the development of the feminist scholarship. Of course, all of us violate various norms. Remember, not crime, but we violate the various norms and rules of society at some point. Clearly, deviance is not solely based about those individuals' behaviors, okay? Rather, crime and deviance occur in a social context, not only the context that generates the behavior, but also the context in which people respond to a deviant act. Again, deviance is a behavior that violates social norms and is recognized in doing so. Because the sociological understanding of deviance is so deeply connected to the context in which it occurs, the social reality of gender as well as of race, class, and other social factors is critical in explaining deviance, as well as crime and violence. So therefore, when you look at the social reality of even the variables such as gender, race, and class as social factors and reason why people commit crime. So I have a whole chapter on deviance and crime in my intro to the sociology class. You can look up on my YouTube channel, Jerry Logan Professor. There's my introductory class. There's a whole PowerPoint in which I talk about crime and deviance, and I get more to the sociological perspectives. But there is some of the variables such as race, class, and gender, which I do talk about as well. Such a perspective is very different from the common explanations of deviance and crime found among the public. Most often, people explain crime and deviance as the result of these individual wrongdoings. Sociological and feminist explanations go further by looking at the social structure of gender. So they go a little bit more deeper, looking at the social structure. Why does these behaviors occur? Who do they happen to? And how is the behaviors treated in these, again, as I talked about before, these social institutions? The social structure of gender is critically important in analyzing patterns of crime and deviance in the society. The earliest studies of gender and deviance reflected highly sexist assumptions about women. So again, we got to look at from a study point of view. We're going back historically, and when we go back historically, there lacks a lot of the pertinent information that we have access to today. Like we can't just, back then they couldn't Google something up, and they based upon their research on previous persons who did so-called research on this stuff when they studied gender. So the early studies of gender and deviance reflect the highly sexist assumptions. These are all assumptions about women, and for a long time distorted what was known about women, both as crime, victims and perpetrators of crime. Some of these ideas seem downright absurd now, but they frame some of the early assumptions about gender, crime, and deviance. Most significantly, they illustrate how explanations of crime and deviance are often anchored, purposefully or not, in the prevailing modes of thought at the time. So there are different sociologists, there are different criminologists who came up with this perspective on crime and deviance, and there's the assumption of this is why women commit crime, this is why men commit crime, and this is some of the earlier thought at that time which would seem to be appropriate based upon the researchers and the scholars at that time. So people respected these scholars and these researchers, and they basically say, oh, well, this is the conclusion I come up with. Highly respected individuals, they became accepted. Of course, later on it became challenged. People saying, you know what, I disagree with that because it doesn't make any sense. It's not showing any correlation. We're not looking into deeper roots behind why people commit crime. So we're going to start out with one of the most famous sociologists, Cesare Lombroso. Maybe y'all have heard of him or not. Look at the time frame of 1835 to 1909 in Italy. During the early time frame, 1800s, there was a lot going on. You can look at the climate of the social structure of society, but it's the culture of society and the socialization process of society going on to the early 1800s. Cesare Lombroso had begun his career working in lunatic asylums, and he became interested in crime and criminals, and he studied Italian soldiers. He was trying to pinpoint the difference between lunatics, criminals, and normal individuals by examining the inmates in the Italian prisons as well. So he's looking at a variety of different things. He's also looking at normalization. This person here, a criminal, what's this? So he's trying to get this information. Very interesting guy, but well respected during his time, known as the father of criminology, modern criminology. He produced the first of 5 editions. So he put in work of Criminal Mind in 1876. He was known as the father of modern criminology. One of the first persons to realize that crime and criminals could be studied scientifically. Lombroso's theory of the born criminal dominated thinking. It's the key word. It dominated thinking about criminal behavior in the late 19th and early 20th century. So a very well respected guy, Cesare Lombroso, on the work that he had done. He believed that criminality was inherited. well, this is deep right here, it's going to get real deep, and that criminals could be identified by their physical defects that confirm them as being basically a savage. So he said basically, Lombroso, based upon his research, remember he's looking at these Italian soldiers, prisoners, and he's saying, okay, physically, from what my research have done, I'm able to identify individuals based upon the crime that they committed, based upon their physical features and physical defects, and I can tell what type of crime they committed, or even what type of crime they may even about to attempt. A thief, for example, according to Lombroso, could be identified by his expressive face. If he had a manual dexterity and small wandering eyes. So this is a thief, based upon Lombroso's research. He's just looking at people and he's studying people and he's doing research. And he said, wow, thieves usually look like this. Habitual murderers, meanwhile, had cold, glassy stares, bloodshot eyes, and these big hawk-like noses. And he said that rapists had jugged ears, physical characteristics. In developing his theory, he concluded that the criminals were physically different. Physically different. The physical characteristics he used to identify prisoners included the symmetry of the face or head. He also described large monkey-like ears, large lips, a twisted nose, excessive cheekbones, long arms, and excessive wrinkles on the skin. Lombroso declared that males with 5 or more of these characteristics could be called and marked as born criminals. If they have 5 or more of these characteristics, that person is a born criminal, according to Lombroso. So you begin to see how he's, like I said again, he's well respected. This is the work. He is being consulted by many people. He is writing out materials. He is writing different editions that talk about the criminality, and it is well respected and became accepted by a lot of people. Lombroso, however, didn't confine his views to male criminals. He co-wrote his first book to examine the causes of female crime and concluded, among other things, that female criminals are far more ruthless than males. They tended to be lustful and immodest, were shorter and more wrinkled, and had darker hair, smaller skulls than normal women, according to Lombroso. Physically looking at them. They did, however, suffer from less baldness, said Lombroso. Women who committed crimes of passion, they had prominent lower jaws, just by looking at them, according to Lombroso, and more wicked than their male counterparts, Lombroso concluded. I know that sounds interesting. You're thinking like, wow, this guy is a well-respected guy, and he's saying based upon the physical characteristics. So you meet a person who has a prominent lower jaws, a woman who has a prominent lower jaws. A man had glossy eyes. If he's, based upon their physical characteristics, you can tell what type of crime. Cesar Lombroso's work in the 1920s is now discredited one of the earliest studies of female crime. He believed that crime represented the survival of primitive traits. Now, his theory was explicitly linked to popular racist and sexist notions of the time. Of course, that was the climate at that time. A lot of racism, a lot of sexism going on. He depicted crime as based on a biological difference between women and men, white and black Americans, and the fit and the unfit, from Lombroso. He explained the female crime basically by arguing that women are less highly evolved than white men, and thus are more susceptible to primitive urges, according to Lombroso. So a lot of this stuff is specific. It has to do with a lot with the weekly discussion questions that I have. So as you look at the weekly discussion questions, remember you're following this part, and even for the exam, you're thinking about, okay, Lombroso is going to be on the exam, deviance, crime, stigma will be some of the exam questions. So make sure you got these different sociologists, criminologists, know the difference between them for the exam purposes, because that is what it's going to be discussing. Like Lombroso, W.I. Thomas traced women's crime to the biological differences between the sexes and to deep-seated psychological wishes. Keyword, he said, wishes of maternalism that he defined as unique to young girls. Thomas' later work, however, contained an important sociological insight that female delinquency is a normal response he stated to even the social conditions, a normal response. So make sure we make, for the exam purpose and the weekly discussion purpose, that we do not mix up Lombroso and W.I. Thomas. Thomas still emphasized, however, that social behavior is a result of primary wishes that are derived from biological instincts, and Thomas views delinquents are driven to crime because they long for new experiences, according to Thomas. Girls in particular, he said, engage in deviance in order to manipulate others. So think about that. Girls in particular engage in deviance in order to manipulate others, and their maternal instincts lead them to crimes, such as prostitution, to which he claims they are seeking love and tenderness, according to Thomas. And again, Thomas is a well-respected guy who is presenting work upon his studies. Although seemingly crude now, Thomas' work has left an important message for more recent sociological work. He attempted to find a behavioral basis for sex differences and delinquency. And he tried, even if unsuccessfully, to relate those differences to the attitudes that we now see as reflecting gender socialization. Again, gender socialization. Socialization is huge. Gender socialization is huge as well. And you can kind of see, they look at the sex differences and delinquency, and they tie it up to the gender socialization. Well, the patterns of women crime can be properly attributed to gender socialization. It continues to be an important question. Like Thomas Lombroso, Otto Polak was traced women's deviance to their biological and their psychological being, 1950. Like Lombroso and Thomas, Otto traced women's deviance to their biological and psychological being. He claimed that the basis for female crime is women's passive role in intercourse, according to Otto. He argued that the real extent of female crime is hidden from the public's view. He said the real extent, like it's being disguised and people can't see it. Women, according to him, are the masterminds behind crime. And he further states that they manipulate men into committing offenses while they themselves remain immune from prosecution. So it's more like I'm going to pull strings. They're the mastermind, according to Otto, stating that women are the mastermind, so therefore the women are the ones behind the scene, and they're getting men to do what they want to, and they avoid prosecution because of the men are actually committing the offenses that their women have mastermind, according to Otto. In his view, men have been so duped by women, according to Otto, is that they protect women through chivalry and thus fear to charge and convict them for their crimes. Even though biologically based arguments about women's criminal behavior have been widely discredited, popular interpretations of criminal behavior still exists in our culture today. So Otto apparently says that it was the women, they behind the crime, they get the men to do it for them. They won't get charged, the ladies won't get charged because the men have been so duped. Although new studies of the brain frequently attempt to explain criminal deviant behavior as rooted in biology, such studies tend to overlook the significant role of society and the role society does play in patterning crime and deviance. Robert Merton puts out strain theory in my intro class. Robert Merton, one of the functions, states that society has no problem with socializing the poor into wanting to own things. And therefore, we are even being bombarded in the media by different images of things that we want to have. And just because we are poor doesn't mean that we do not want the same things. We may not have the access to do so. So therefore, Robert Merton came up with strain theory. Strain is a strain that people experience where they cannot afford to get the things that they want, that they turn to deviant acts. So therefore, it may be society in itself which causes crime and deviance. The significant role that people's social status and position in a structured society, therefore, which causes them to commit deviant acts. Feminist perspectives has added new dimensions to the understanding of deviant criminal behavior. As we have seen, early studies of women deviance rested on stereotypes, of course. They talk about women's sexual behavior. Increasingly, the feminist scholars is also showing how social norms of masculinity also shape the deviant behaviors of boys and men. So the feminist scholars are looking at the men. The social norms of masculinity, how we are supposed to act as men because we have been socialized into that gender socialization of role according to our society standards, that this is masculine and what's considered feminine. That's why that gender socialization is very important, because of the fact that there is a set of rules and norms and everything of how a man is supposed to behave. And if we do not live by their standards, our masculinity will be questioned. So therefore, you have to commit some type of deviant act, or you're trying to get some type of street cred and stuff, credibility, where you are trying to figure out and say, hey, how can I fit in this society as a masculine male according to society standards. As an example, inner city environments are often governed by what they call the code of the street, a system of social interaction that organizes social life in urban areas, particularly interpersonal violence. So this code of the streets, the social life of how we're supposed to act in the urban areas, in the neighborhoods, in the hood. So therefore, one of the biggest things back then was no snitching. Or they would say snitches get stitches. Don't tell. You don't see nothing. You get your street cred by how much crime you commit. It increases your likelihood of being well respected. And it is a system of social interactions. At the heart of this so-called code is a battle for respect among men. They want some respect on their name. And at the heart of this code, again, as I mentioned previously before, there is some earning respect. And the more that I go out there and do it in order to earn the street cred, the more bodies, the more people you shoot, the people you rob, the drugs that you sell, you're basing upon that you are tough and you have to be hard, as they say, growing up in the hood. And therefore, for inner city boys and men, respect and manhood are often one. And the same young men may be willing to risk their lives to attain this respect and this street cred and be respected by others as a man. So therefore, we have put this pressure in society on these young boys, especially in these so-called urban neighborhoods, of what a man is supposed to be. And we're tough. And a lot of them may not have that toughness about them, but you have to front and act as if you do. And when you front and act as if you do, you become to get more respect. And sometimes you can't fight good. Fighting gone from back in the day. We used to throw hands, we used to fight. But now it's all about a gun. These kids don't want to fight, they want to shoot each other. All it takes is them to squeeze a trigger, and they can take someone's life, hurt them, anything. There belongs the power in that part. And so certain people are getting respected in the neighborhood by how many people they have shot or robbed, how many people they done beat up or jumped, earning that street cred, how much time they done did in jail. Street credibility. Social norms of masculinity also can shape men's behavior in other contexts. Homosocial interaction plays a role in how men do masculinity, namely achieving a masculine status by putting others down. In peer groups, for example, when you humiliate, degrade women, is a strategy men and boys use to prove their manhood. Doing so is a way that they bond with other group members. It's unfortunate when I read this. It's unfortunate because of the fact that some guys criticize and put down women, calling them out their names, calling them bees, to prove their manhood. That don't, in my opinion, don't prove no manhood by degrading other people. You're picking on somebody else because it makes yourself look tough. You go out in a group and you say, oh, I'm going to target this group. A man beating up on a woman, that's not a good thing where you figuring you're going to humiliate a woman and you're going to put her down and then you're going to beat her on your chest to prove your masculinity. That's not doing masculinity. A man's masculinity, even sexual preference, and criticizing and putting them down is not a thing. Calling somebody out their name because of their sexual preference is not a man thing to do. So therefore, it's confusing to people thinking that. And I look at this, the social norms. There's this expectation of masculinity. It shapes men's behavior in other contexts. The key thing, it shapes men's behavior. And the fact that they believe I can achieve this masculine status by putting other people down. So therefore you find victims, people that you pick on, who you know may not even fight back, who you may know that, oh, we're outnumbered, they're not going to do anything. And you beat on your chest for this masculinity that you have. And I'm going to sit back and they're going to try to get street credibility. But then another thing, well, let's just put down women. Let's degrade women so we can get respect. Unfortunately, the female scholars, they did call it out. And unfortunately, some guys do this, which is very bad. Now, by studying the gender context in which deviant behaviors occurs, you can also see that deviance involves a social labeling process. Labeling theory is huge. One cannot be called a deviant without being recognized as a deviant. You can't say somebody a deviant if they ain't even active. You got to be recognized as a deviant for somebody to call you out as a deviant person. And sometimes people become labeled as deviant regardless of whether or not they actually engaged in deviant behavior. You are labeled this is that part. So some folks are being, labeled as a deviant. And that's not even what they want. Some people admire that. Oh yeah, I'm a thug. But at the same time, some people are like, no, I'm not. Labeling theory. It emphasizes, and of course you all know this more of an exam question, you got to know labeling theory emphasizes that some groups with the power to label deviants exercise control of what and who is considered deviants. Police, the courts, school authorities, and other agents of the state thus yield a great amount of power through their control of these institutions. For example, social workers, psychiatrists, and other agents of the state who define a woman as mentally ill can have a drastic effect on her behavior, identity, and life options. I always looked at labeling theory, and I remember studying this even in college. Labeling theory is a very cool thing, and then it could be a bad thing. So if you label someone as a deviant, you bad. You keep saying, I heard people say, them kids are bad as hell. Ooh, y'all some bad kids. And they may be. Kids might be disruptive, tearing up stuff, but you keep labeling them as deviants and bad and worthless and useless. They may even begin to believe that, and it becomes a label that goes upon them that carry on for the rest of their life. I do not like when you say to people, say, oh, they stupid. You stupid. These kids are dumb. They ain't going to be nothing. That label carries with them, and it affects how they see themselves. Again, it can have a drastic effect on your behavior, identity, even your life options. Well, you ain't going to be able to make it to college. You're not that smart. You might want to go get a trade or something like that. They told me that when I was a kid. Oh, you maybe just go get a trade. I said, no, I'm not. I'm going to college. Well, why are you going to waste yourself on college and you ain't going to be able to do nothing with the degree? I said, I turned into, like, don't believe me, just watch. And I have the confidence. But labeling theory also be a good thing when you label people as scholars. I say to my students and all young people and students, old people, young people, middle-aged people, whatever it may be, labeling theory, you are a success. And you are successful. I'm going to label you as a professor, a knowledgeable person, a scholar, a success, period. Tell these people and tell these kids that y'all smart. You are going to be successful. Don't tell them nothing negative or you ain't going to be nothing. Because I heard it so much. That labeling theory is huge. And you all see, with the power to label deviance, it has power along with that labeling theory. Let's exercise it correctly. Labeling theory would be on the exam. Make sure you're familiar with that. It teaches us that social judgments have enormous power to shape people's experiences in society. Further, those judgments are typically entangled with judgments made about gender. Unfortunate. You can't be none. That's a man's job. You're a girl. No, that's usually what guys do. Judgments. My little girl, I tell her daughter, mother girl, you can be whatever you want to be. You can do what you want to do. And they have success that goes with it. Let's continue to label the theory in a positive way. It affects your social class when people they're living in poverty. Or you may never make it out of poverty. You'll never make it out of hood. The only way you can get out of here is sell drugs or rap or play sports. And race. Whole nother topic. The social institutions, persons' behaviors that affects race of all races, as you'll see throughout this chapter. Labeling theory helps us see that deviance occurs in the context of the social institutions. People in these institutions have the power to label some as deviant as others are not. In these social institutions, we look at the role of mass media. I'm not going to go there real deep, but we look at the role of mass media. And it begins that sometimes the mass media can sometimes influence. One of the social institutions influences our behavior and what we think of people. And if we have not been around a certain group of people, we may believe based upon the label that they have been given and being reinforced through the social institutions of how this person or group of people may be, that it becomes accepted and you believe that. Back then in the history, I'm not going to go there too deep, but the Native Americans were considered to be savages. They were labeled as savages. Therefore, if you do harm them, you're not harming a real person, was the perception back then. The fact that it is especially true to the degree that the official agents of these institutions carry gender, race, and class stereotypes or biases. Unfortunately, there are stereotypes and biases that goes on of all race. There's a stereotype. I talk about it in my race and ethnicity class. As well, I talk about it a little bit as well in my intro class, my chapter on race and ethnicity, that every race and culture and ethnicity has a unique story. However, there have been stereotypes and biases towards them. Same thing that goes on with gender. More likely to discover deviance in some groups than others. These agents include the police, the judge, the lawyers, the prison guards, and others who may enter the official process of labeling deviant behavior. As example, a psychologist can give you a diagnosis. A psychiatrist can give you a diagnosis. A counselor can give you a diagnosis. Social workers and even teachers label this. So therefore, when we label people with these titles, this person, ADHD, schizophrenic, whatever the DSM-4 talks about, if this person's diagnosis, we have to be careful that we make sure we make a correct diagnosis and that this labeling theory does not affect how they live and how people perceive them to be. But to sit back and say, well, all these dudes are thugs and they gangsters and they committed criminal acts, but let's not label all of people because of the fact that it is being labeled upon them by the police, judges, and lawyers and prison guards. So they have an influence according to each chart. This slide right here, these agents have the influence to be able to put that title on individuals that may even claim to be deviant. And at the same time, it is reinforced by these agents of psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, social workers, and teachers because of the position that they have. Because official agents of social institutions have the power to label some groups and persons as deviants and others are not, because these institutions reflect the power structure. Again, these persons are in the position of the power structure, and there is a system of race, class, and gender relations, how they are being interrelated into the society. Deviance tends to be a label that falls more frequently on less powerful people in the society, according to the author of this book. Again, deviance tends to be a label that falls more frequently on less powerful people in the society. The label of deviant behavior can thus be seen, according to the author, as a form of social control. Now, in sum, the feminist perspectives of social deviance emphasize the importance of gender as a social structure in shaping not only the behavior, but also the response to deviant behavior by both individuals and by social institutions. When you study violence against women, violence against that women and men commit, or the treatment of men and women in the criminal justice system, gender is always a significant factor. Understand the factors that influence gender and criminal behavior. In general, women commit much less crimes than men do, both violent crimes and property crimes. Also, despite public opinion to the contrary, crime by men and women have been decreasing in recent years, according to the author. Some basic questions asked by criminologists are, is the amount of crime by women beginning to approximate the amount of male crime? How are women's crimes linked to gender in society? Is women's crimes connected to changes in these gender roles? And the title for this particular slide is Women as Criminals. Now, explaining women's crimes, some criminologists suggest that the pattern of crime among women represents extensions of their gender roles. So they kind of look at certain roles, when they look at the gender roles and the crimes, shoplifting, credit card fraud, and the passing of bad checks result from the opportunities women have as consumers. At the same time, the crimes that are less frequent for women, for example, armed robbery, aggravated assault, forgery, and counterfeiting, involve either physical strength or economic opportunities. Activities more usually associated with men's gender roles. So you see where they're going with this. These patterns suggest that women's involvement in criminal behavior changes when there are changes in their social role. The argument is that shifts in gender roles make women more willing to participate in crime, and that this explains recent increases in crime among women. Now, changing in women's situation, particularly the greater labor force participation of women, also mean that more criminal opportunities are available to them. Keep in mind, however, that the increases in women's crimes that show up in the arrest statistics do not necessarily reflect an increase in the actual extent of crime. They may simply reflect an increase in the detection of women's crimes, because police may be more likely to arrest women for offenses that they commit, given changes in attitudes about women. We're talking about historical changes that have been taking place throughout the years and years. Changes in the rate of women's crime also result from the broad structural changes in society. So look at the structure of society and the changes that take place. Greater reliance on electronic transactions. So society has changed. Credit cards and self-service markets had increased the opportunities for crime for all consumers. At the same time, detection systems, including the national information systems, technology, surveillance, and even the expansion of the private security forces have increased the amount of social control and law enforcement. So they got an eye on you by watching this more advanced security forces, information systems, and technological surveillance, in which now they can see what's going on, but some consider this as a matter of social control. Now, increases in women crime have been almost entirely in property crimes. Miller argues that increased labor force participation of women has been especially significant in predicting women's crime because occupational segregation depresses the wages of women workers. So they're going there. Occupation segregation, less money, it depresses the wages of women's workers. At the same time, when they include race, minority, poor, and younger women, the intersectionality theory of all three, they face a labor market in which, when they find work, they are in low-paid jobs with little opportunity of advancement, according to the author. The effect is the creation of an underclass of women for whom criminal activity may be the only means of supporting themselves and their children. Unfortunately, I was on Chicago. I was walking down Roosevelt Road, and they had a Target, believed by Clark Street, and the police was carrying this young lady out in handcuffs. And the young lady had to be 18, 19, even 20 years old, appeared to be pregnant, was walking away in handcuffs, and she had on a Target shirt, and her name tag was on there as she's being brought into the police car. And this was close to Christmas time, and I looked at the officers, and I was like, wow. They said, hey, we just doing our job. You know, they said, well, like in a sad way, unfortunate, that this woman had been caught stealing at the register, taking money. For whatever reason, I don't know. You know, but this unfortunate situation that, you know, this they caught on camera through surveillance, and she was stealing money from the register. Whether she did it to take care of her children or pregnancy, as far as an unborn child, family members. I've known cases in growing up in poverty where that people committed crimes, things like that, fraud, stealing money, and a lot of times not to be some type of rich person, but just for basic, simple necessities of life of feeding kids, that they committed crimes. Miller's explanation of women's crime placed the causes in the context of women's class status. They're looking at the status. Thereby also supported a long-standing association sociologists have seen between poverty, unemployment, and crime. This explanation of crime is particularly compelling because it explains women's and men's crime in the context, again, of this structural characteristics that involve class, race, and gender relations. Although the majority of the poor are certainly not criminals, poverty and blocked opportunity goes back to string theory, and the economic need they create are major underlying causes of crime. A friend of mine got robbed on the south side of Chicago. She had a fur coat on, and she was going to a friend's house, her and a friend of hers, and the guy pulled out a gun on her at night on the south side of Chicago. And he said, hey, I don't want your purse. I want the cash that you have inside. Keep your ID and your credit card. He said, I just need cash. And he apologized. He said, I'm sorry. I have a family to take care of. I didn't want her credit cards. Didn't want her ID. Didn't want her fur coat. He just wanted cash. And my friend had obliged to it, gave him cash that they had, both of the ladies. And he ran out saying, I'm sorry. So, although the majority of the poor are certainly not criminals, poverty and the block opportunity and the economic need that they create are major underlying causes of crime. So some people out here committing crimes and deviant acts, not just for their own personal greed, it may be for basic necessities. Further, Becker and McCorkle found that when women commit crimes with at least one male co-offender, they are several times more likely to be involved in more serious and traditionally male crimes, such as robbery, drug trafficking, gambling, homicide, kidnapping, burglary, and women's offenses. So there's a television show. I can't remember exactly what channel. I think it's on OWN channel, on a BET. It's called For My Man, in which you can YouTube For My Man, in which women were committing crimes for their man. So therefore, the guy may be doing a crime, and she got involved with the crime spree, and then she got caught up, and she had no idea. And things like that happen, where cases of a guy, he was getting pulled over, police were watching him, known drug dealer, he gets pulled over, they following him, he immediately put the guns and drugs in her purse and said, baby, they're not gonna search you, they just looking for me. He got out the car with nothing on him. They searched him and they said, let's search the car. And when they got to her, who had the gun and the drugs in her purse, she said, you know what? This is mine. And they said, ma'am, we know this belongs to this guy. We just have to hear you say it. She said, no, it is mine. She took that case And the police knew, the courts knew, everybody knew. Just tell on him. Just let him know. She stuck by him, so he didn't go to jail. They had to release him. And then while she's incarcerated, waiting on a trial date, she continued her story. It was mine. Come to find out, I think she had to do 2 or 3 years in prison. She was sentenced to. While she was incarcerated, her boyfriend, who she stood up for, said the drugs was hers, he wound up getting another woman pregnant. And of course, she was devastated. She heard about it while incarcerated. And then he got caught up, I think a couple of years later, on a drug case, gun case, and got 7 years in prison. Had she done it from the beginning, he brought her into this world. He'd take these drugs, and that is the problem that a lot of guys were doing, was putting the drugs and money on the women, and the women saying, "Well, it's mine," if they get caught, figuring that the women would get less, jail time, well, she would probably get none at all. So some of these so-called guys use these women as a pawn to commit deviant and criminal acts. The finding further reinforced the argument that women on their own lack access to the networks and experience necessary to participate in male-dominated serious crime networks. The number of women in prison is this will talk about women in prison, so just be careful. I tell people, and I also have a daughter, like, hey, don't the company that you keep. When there's one lady, she was with her boyfriend. I know I'm telling a bunch of stories. That's a sign of, I guess, getting old now. Got a lot of old man stories. So one lady was going to McDonald's with her boyfriend. He said, "I'll be back." He went in there and robbed the McDonald's. He came running out. I don't know if he shot somebody or he hurt somebody. He ran out with some money to my drive. Let's go. So she wound up driving off. Police chased them. She crashed. He ran out. She went to jail because of the fact that she participated in this robbery. They eventually caught the guy, gave him some time in prison, and gave her some time in prison. And all she did was taking her guy to go get some McDonald's. And he decides he want to get a lick, let's say a robbery. And she like, "No, what the heck?" Guy went and did it and jumped in your car. I would have left him in that parking lot and drove off. As soon as he said he about to go do something, okay, all right, and drove off. But unfortunately, the young lady was caught in a position in which she was incarcerated. So now talking about women in prison, the number of women in prison is a small percentage, just 7% of all state and federal prisons. The rate of male and female imprisonment has been decreasing, although women's imprisonment is decreasing at a slower rate than the men's. A disproportionate number of people in prisons are members of racial minority groups. Women's prisons are smaller than men's prisons, but also becoming increasingly overcrowded. More and more, however, women in prison are being treated no differently than how men are treated. A mixed message, since this means that women are now subject to much of the same degradation as the male prisoners. Healthcare in women's prisons is also limited, particularly in meeting needs specific to women's medical and reproductive care, because some of the women may be pregnant. Many women enter prison with existing medical problems, including drug addiction, psychiatric illness, hypertension, and respiratory disease. For example, 4.1% of state women inmates and 2.9% of federal women inmates were pregnant at the time of the confinement. So they're coming in the door pregnant. If women become pregnant while in prison, they may have a long wait for medical care, making abortion a potentially high risk. Some facilities do not allow abortions at all. Should a woman prisoner carry through her pregnancy, she may not receive adequate prenatal care. Of course, we need that. And when she gives birth, she is likely to be separated from her child. Women in prison say that separation from their children is the most difficult part of their sentence, and they see few alternatives for their children's care. Any separation from your child, speaking as a father, as a parent, is very difficult. So unfortunately, these ladies had to endure this. They typically give them up for adoption, release them to foster care, or leave them with relatives. The choice most often selective. Studies find that the women in prison are greatly concerned for their children and that this strain can be reduced by engaging them in mothering activities. So they bring the babies up to the prison, to the jail, so the mothers can see their babies. And you know, a lot of times people bring people and they go to 26 in California. I've seen where they in the visiting room and you go in that little side room and people bring the babies and give them some hope, knowing that their child is okay. Now, the recidivism rates, the position of being rearrested, so recidivism rate of when people get rearrested for female offenders is reduced by 33%, where women are permitted to have their children located within the prison at a prison nursery. However, most prisons do not provide nursery facilities and continue to separate newborns from their mothers shortly, if not immediately after birth. So they give birth to the babies and hey, whoa, we gotta take the baby. I give you an hour, I give you 2 hours, I give you 5 minutes, and therefore the baby is gone. So a woman who has carried this child for 9 months and feel this child kicking and developing a bond, and unfortunately she is incarcerated, but then once the baby is born, they take the baby away. Devastating feelings for any parent. Furthermore, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has instituted anti-shackling policies for federal facilities. Now this is interesting. The majority of states still shackle their expected mothers before, during, and after childbirth, even when the mother's a nonviolent offender, which we now includes most women prisoners. So therefore, women are shackled. I was there when my daughter was born. My ex-wife, it was my child's mother. She would tell her to squeeze and push, and I think she almost broke my arm the way she squeezed me. So I said, well, let's grab my hand. My hand was a little bit stronger. I think I still have some pain from that, but it was a very intense moment to watch her go through that, and to be shackled during that time is very difficult. I mean, where is she going? Excuse me, I'm not making light of it, but where is she going? She's about to deliver birth. She's not about to run out the place. But that's humiliating, in my opinion, before and during and after the childbirth, and you're in a locked facility. For women offenders brought before the criminal justice system, a number of gender factors influences the court's decisions. Studies show that whether or not a defendant adheres to traditional gender roles, which is interesting, influences the court sentencing decisions for both men and women if they adhere to these traditional gender roles. Now they got this the chivalry hypothesis, of course. When you all take my exam, stuff like this is gonna pop out. Definitions, labeling theory, definitions, theories, individuals. These are discussed. It's going to be more likely on my exam, and it's kind of hard for me to sit back and say, hey, read over these 3 or 4 chapters. I try to make it minimum, and I use discussion questions to help students to be more familiar with the exam and say, hey, these discussion questions more likely could be leading to an exam questions. But the chivalry hypothesis explains that women are given lighter sentences because of their assumed weakness and need for protection as both victims as offenders. This leniency, however, is not afforded to women offenders who do not fit within traditional gender roles. Interesting. The chivalry hypothesis for the exam. Women who commit more male violent crimes or who do not fit the maternal role, that is being single or childless, are not treated in a chivalrous manner according to the author and are therefore more likely to be sentenced more harshly than women defendants who fit within these traditional gender roles. Interesting. Men are sentenced more harshly when they commit crimes against women because their crimes do not fit within the traditionally masculine role in which men are providers and protectors of women. I was raised up from birth. You're a man, you are a provider and protector by nature of women. So there is that mindset of this traditional masculine role in which we have been socialized according to the culture, also the family. So you may have a judge who sits there and says, hey, you are a man, you are a provider, protector, and you put your hands on women. These findings show that how traditional notions of gender, women as mothers and men as providers, influence the court's decisions because they have a specific bias and they have a specific culture and how they were raised up and how we're supposed to be, including the jury pick. Even when they may irrelevant to the case at hand, there are traditional notions of gender that people look at. Somewhat ironically, studies show that the number of women in prison is highest in these countries where women have advanced the most with regard to education, employment, and their overall social success. Interesting. Perhaps this reflected the protective attitudes towards women as well as more opportunities for women to engage in crime. But also show the need for women's advancement to continue so that they will not experience the abusive relationships that can land them in prison. Unfortunately, abusive relationships. Also, women need better opportunities in the so-called outside world to reduce the need to commit property crimes. Clearly, the increase in the number of women in prison calls for new social policies to deal with this growing population, including programs to help women readjust to a productive life once they are released. That's all I have for this particular chapter. I tell students to use this chapter as a way, I like to lecture, as you all see. I'm a lecturer, and I try to cut the time down, but at the same time, use it as a way as you're reviewing the exam, discussion questions. Always, any questions you have, feel free to email me, hit me up. If you want to, request a meeting, that's fine. I just want to make sure I get the best and teach you all the best I can, and hopefully you learn a lot from this class. So, have a good one.